Gunshots echoed in the daylight while mothers were ambushed right outside their homes and whole neighborhoods froze in silence. The streets of Broward County turned into something nobody could ever imagine, where rivals stopped targeting just enemies and started going after family. Out here in Florida, the beef ran deeper than rap videos and street codes because it touched the people who never thought they would be part of it. Broward was supposed to be another Florida county where families raised kids away from Miami chaos, but under that quiet picture, a storm was building. What happened here was not another hood beef that faded away. It was reckless and personal, and it turned into one of the bloodiest street wars Florida has seen. People outside Florida usually think Broward County is just beaches, suburbs, and people moving north to escape Miami prices. They see palm trees, shopping plazas, and big houses with driveways, but they do not see what was moving underneath. Behind the postcard image, the streets were slowly filling with young kids carrying grudges, survival instincts, and a hunger for recognition. Broward was not supposed to be where the violence made headlines, but the county was building its own underworld in silence. The image of Broward as some Florida man joke spot made people ignore the real pressure inside these neighborhoods. The police reports were filled with robberies, home invasions, and young people caught with guns, but most folks outside never paid attention. Miami had already built a name with drug wars and high-profile crime, so most reporters stayed focused there. Broward's violence was not always on the front page, but the streets were recording every move. Generations of kids were growing up watching Miami legends, and they were ready to create their own names. One of the biggest influences on Broward came from Haitian immigration that changed South Florida starting in the late 70s and early 80s. Families fleeing Duvalier's Haiti arrived in Miami neighborhoods like Little Haiti, where discrimination and poverty forced them to defend themselves. Out of that struggle came groups like Zoe Pound that started as protection, but grew into one of the most feared names in Miami. By the mid-90s, Zoe Pound was connected to robberies, shootings, and major fraud operations, and the reputation reached far outside of Miami. That DNA spread as Haitian families kept moving north into Broward, looking for affordable housing and a safer life. By the late 90s and early 2000s, new branches and offshoots of Zoe Pound started appearing in places like Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood, and Dania Beach. Crews like Zoe Mafia Family carried the same codes, the same attitude, and the same hustle, but with their own Broward flavor. These kids were not copying Miami. They were building their own cliques out of the same struggles. The streets of Broward did not look like Liberty City or Overtown, but the same survival laws applied. It did not take long before Broward's name started getting linked to robberies, drug stashes, and shootings. Liberian youth were also part of this mix after many families escaped wars in West Africa and landed in Florida. Communities around Dania Beach and Hollywood saw Liberian kids blending with Haitian kids in schools and neighborhoods. That mix created bonds, but also created rivalries when it came to territory, respect, and money. By the mid-2000s, both Haitian and Liberian cliques were forming their own squads with names that started buzzing on the block. These new groups were watching what Miami had done before, but Broward's kids wanted their own recognition. The overlooked part of this story is how Broward became a battleground while outsiders were still pointing fingers at Miami. Broward was growing fast with new developments and suburban neighborhoods, but inside those pockets, the tension was rising. Kids who were supposed to be the sons and daughters of immigrants trying to chase the American dream were chasing a different type of respect. They carried guns, formed crews, and started to see each other as enemies more than neighbors. That reality was not in the tourist guides, but it was showing up in homicide reports and police task force memos. While Miami was already known for big drug operations and legendary names, Broward was underestimated. That underestimation gave crews space to grow without heavy spotlight, and it let things get darker without much early intervention. By the time police and reporters finally caught on, Broward's gangs had already built reputations and body counts. The county might have looked safer from the outside, but inside certain blocks the rules were completely different. The growth of these immigrant-rooted crews set the stage for one of the most vicious rivalries Florida had ever seen. Broward County's hidden underworld was not built overnight. It was the product of decades of migration, neglect, and survival. Haitian and Liberian kids were inheriting struggles their parents thought they had escaped, and they were responding with their own codes. Miami's history showed them how gangs could grow, and Broward's overlooked streets gave them the space to build. What started as scattered cliques and neighborhood crews was already shaping into the foundation of Zone 10 and HMT Liberia. The underworld of Broward was now ready to explode, and the world would soon be forced to notice. Dania Beach sits right below Fort Lauderdale. Tucked in Broward County with beaches on one side and tough neighborhoods inside, the city might look like a small Florida spot with palm trees and motels, but the blocks told another story. Immigrant families from Haiti and Liberia found cheap housing here and raised kids surrounded by both hope and pressure. Generations grew up walking those streets, and everybody knew each other's names, but the streets also carried politics that outsiders never really understood. The older folks came chasing a better life, but the younger ones created something else entirely. Dania Beach became the breeding ground for crews that were ready to make their own marks. The Liberian neighborhood sat just a few minutes away from Dania Beach, packed with Liberian families who carried memories of civil wars back home. Kids born in Florida were raised hearing stories about struggle, survival, and violence from their parents. They grew up in apartments and small houses where money was always short and opportunities were limited. That environment created a sense of unity, but also bred a drive to find shortcuts to respect. Liberia kids carried that toughness everywhere, and the neighborhood got its reputation as one of the roughest in Broward. Locals called them wicked steppers because their young men moved like soldiers on every block. To many people, it was just another neighborhood, but to the kids involved, it was a training ground for gang life. Out of Dania Beach came Zone 10, a small crew that quickly built a name through violence and robberies. Zone 10 might have started as just another local squad, but their style was reckless and aggressive. They did not have the size of Miami's gangs, but they had heart and they had no fear. Their name spread after a few bold robberies and the way they carried themselves in the streets. Everybody in Broward soon knew that Zone 10 kids would run up in your house without hesitation. That image built them a reputation far bigger than their numbers. When Zone 10 linked with the Nightmares, a crew connected to Psycho Bob, the mix created something larger. Together they branded themselves Double M, which stood for more money, more motion, and more murder. The name alone showed exactly where their minds were, and the streets started to fear the new alliance. Psycho Bob, known off the block as Comrell Smart, had been running around Dania since his teenage years. His Nightmare squad had a reputation for catching licks and pulling moves all around Broward. The merger with Zone 10 was natural because both squads were hungry and reckless. The name Double M soon appeared in music, graffiti, and street talk across the county. Young kids admired their rise while older residents stayed quiet because they knew the violence could land on their doorsteps. Zone 10 and the Nightmares built an alliance that no one in Broward could ignore anymore. On the other side of this story was HMT, known fully as Hit My Target, which carried weight across Broward and Miami. HMT drew heavily from Haitian kids and their allies in Liberia. Their base in the Liberian neighborhood gave them a reputation as some of the most ruthless young men in South Florida. Everybody in Broward knew if you were from Liberia, you carried yourself with that hard edge. HMT and Liberia kids were inseparable, and together they built one of the most feared names in the county. Their reputation as wicked steppers was not just talk, it came from the way they moved on real missions. These crews were not just hanging out on corners, they were active in robberies, shootings, and hustles. Some of the earliest faces tied to this brewing storm became familiar names across Florida's underground. Wisdom Williams, better known as Wiz the Wizard, came out of Broward as a rapper tied into the streets. Wiz carried connections with Sniper Gang and made noise with his music, but the streets always surrounded his name. Comrell Smart, better known as Psycho Bob, was another early face whose name traveled outside Dania Beach. Psycho Bob grew up wild and reckless and eventually ended up connected to Kodak Black's circle. Trayvon Key, known as HMT Trey, represented the Haitian money team and became one of the most active figures. His reputation tied him to shootings and violent scores across Broward and Miami. Sigmund Brown, known on the block as Liberia Sig, became the face of Liberia's steppers. His leadership inside Dania Hot Boys and his Liberian background gave him both power and notoriety. These were the names that shaped the foundation of the Broward feud. In neighborhoods like Dania Beach and Liberia, street reputations mattered just as much as money. A young man could build his name by how he carried himself during fights or robberies. Respect came from how you moved and who you stood beside in the streets. As social media became part of everyday life, these reputations extended far beyond the block. Instagram lives, Facebook posts, and viral videos became the new streets where crews measured clout. Zone 10 members and HMT members would drop posts after shootings, mocking rivals and showing off guns. Videos of young men counting money or rapping about bodies created attention that fueled their confidence. What used to be whispered in neighborhoods was now broadcast to thousands with a single click. Rap culture blended with this life until nobody could tell where the music ended and the real violence began. Songs dropped by local rappers referenced dead rivals and neighborhood beefs directly. Diss tracks spread on YouTube and fans replayed them, unaware that every line might trigger another retaliation. Kodak Black's rise and his Sniper Gang label gave even more attention to names tied to Broward. When Psycho Bob became associated with Kodak, his crew gained credibility, both musically and on the streets. Wiz the Wizard used music to tell his own story, but the ties to the street never left him. Rap was no longer just entertainment in Broward. It was a battlefield of words that spilled into bullets. Young fans cheered on their favorite rappers while mothers prayed their kids did not become the next casualty. By the late 2010s, Broward had two clear sides ready for battle. Zone 10 with MM on one side and HMT with Liberia on the other. The tension was already built into the neighborhoods. The reputations were set, and the social media posts kept pouring gasoline on the fire. Both sides had young leaders. Both sides had hungry soldiers, and both sides wanted the crown of Broward. The foundation of the Zone 10 versus HMT and Liberia feud was built in those years. The stage was ready for a violent story that would shock even people used to Florida headlines. These origins showed how a small county grew names that rivaled Miami legends. What came next would show just how far the streets of Broward were willing to take things. Derek Slade grew up in Dania Beach, where every block seemed like it carried both opportunity and danger. People knew him as Soldier Slade because from a young age he moved with that fearless soldier mindset. He was born into a Haitian American family that struggled like many others in Broward County. School never held his attention for long, and teachers remembered him for fights and suspensions. By the time he was in middle school, Slade was already catching charges for small robberies. His friends noticed that he was always ready to take things one step further than anyone else. That reputation followed him and gave him the respect of other kids in the neighborhood. Camrell Smart was another Dania Beach kid with a story that ran parallel to Slade's. People around him called him Psycho Bob because of the way he acted out. His name came from how he would fight with no fear, even when odds were against him. Teachers at Olson Middle School remembered him as loud, reckless, and constantly in trouble. He caught his first arrest around age 12 when police picked him up for a small robbery. Not long after, he was back in juvenile detention for another incident involving stolen property. The name Psycho was not just a nickname, it was his lifestyle. He built his reputation inside juvenile hall, where fighting became part of his survival routine. Other kids feared him and respected him for never backing down. Slade and Smart both moved through Dania Beach streets as teenagers already marked by police as troublemakers. Their friendship was built on long afternoons skipping class, chasing girls, and planning ways to make money. They shared the same frustrations about school, poverty, and being underestimated. When they started hitting licks together, their bond turned into a partnership. People in Dania knew them as the young duo who would run into homes or stick up someone at gunpoint. Their names traveled quickly because they were young but dangerous. That connection gave them both confidence to move heavier in the streets. Slade's reputation for violence truly exploded in November 2015 when he went on a series of murders. On November 3rd, he invaded a home in Dania Beach with 2 accomplices and shot an innocent man dead. The very next day, he broke into another home in the same area and killed another man. Just 3 weeks later, on November 25th, he ambushed a home in Hollywood, Florida, and shot a 3rd victim. Each killing seemed more senseless than the last, and every move was caught on surveillance cameras. Federal prosecutors later described him as the heart of a RICO conspiracy that spread fear across Broward. Slade bragged on social media about the murders and claimed them as proof of his crew's reputation. For investigators, it showed how far he had gone into the darkness of the streets. Psycho Bob was moving on his own path during those years, not as reckless as Slade, but still knee-deep in crime. His first major arrest came when he was still a teenager, caught with stolen goods and small weapons. Police reports from Broward list his name over and over again across different years. Every time he was locked up, he built stronger ties with other young offenders. His time in juvenile hall only made him more popular on the streets once he got released. The name Psycho stuck because he would swing on anybody, whether rival gang members or other kids in lockup. By the time he was out in late teens, Psycho Bob already had the aura of a young boss. The bond between Slade and Smart made them stand out, but their lives split after 2015. Slade's murder spree caught up with him quickly, when law enforcement stacked heavy charges against him. By 2022, federal courts sentenced him to double life, plus 30 years for RICO, robbery, and murder. That locked him away forever, and his name became legend on the block. Kids in Broward mentioned Slade's name when they talked about who really lived the gangster life. His reckless choices left families destroyed and his own life sealed behind prison walls. The story of Soldier Slade became one of the most notorious chapters in Broward's violent history. Psycho Bob's story took another direction when he crossed paths with Bill Capri, better known as Kodak Black. While locked up, Bob connected with Kodak's circle through mutual friends and neighborhood ties. Kodak saw him as someone who could represent the street image that Sniper Gang embraced. When Bob got out, he started pushing into rap while still keeping his foot in the streets. Kodak Black officially signed him to Sniper Gang, branding him as Psycho Bob for the rap industry. That deal gave Bob a platform to release music while his street reputation backed up his image. He rapped about his life, his friends, and the beef surrounding Broward County. Even though Psycho Bob became Psycho Bob in the rap world, his ties to Dania Beach never faded. His mother Dorothy Smart still lived there and his crew still operated around those neighborhoods. He might have stood on stages and dropped tracks, but his enemies still saw him as the same Psycho Bob from Dania. His name was connected to Zone 10 and MM, the crew that merged from his Nightmares squad. So even as he moved toward music, he could not leave the beef behind. Every diss track, every live video, every street move kept him locked into the war building in Broward. Slade and Bob were two sides of the same coin, both born out of Dania Beach and both chasing power. Slade went all the way reckless and ended up behind bars for life. Bob turned his chaos into rap clout but still carried the weight of his street past. Their friendship showed how Broward raised kids who carried ambition, violence, and dreams all mixed together. One became a cautionary tale, while the other tried to reinvent himself with music. Their stories proved that Dania Beach was more than palm trees and beaches. It was a training ground for legends and tragedies alike. On October 17, 2016, the streets of Dania Beach shifted forever after the murder of a young man named Jib. He was the younger brother of Wisdom Williams, better known across Broward and Miami rap circles as Wiz the Wizard. Jib was not the most famous name in the neighborhood, but he carried ties that made his death impossible to ignore. That night he was caught in the wrong situation, and Zone 10 members were quickly linked to the shooting. The whispers on the block traveled faster than the official reports, and by morning, everyone knew who was involved. That moment pushed the simmering tension into something that could no longer be hidden. An eyewitness known on the streets as Bankhead survived that shooting and later identified the shooter involved. His survival gave law enforcement a chance to press charges, but his testimony also sparked more conversation in the hood. Police eventually made an arrest based on his identification, yet the court case meant nothing to the young men on the streets. They saw Jib's death as something personal that no courtroom could balance. For them, the feud was no longer about stolen property, small beefs, or neighborhood pride. Jib's death marked the start of a different type of conflict where respect and revenge carried more weight than any legal system. That moment turned whispers of rivalry into a declaration of war. Zone 10 members who were already feared for reckless robberies now carried the weight of being blamed for the death of Wiz's brother. In the streets, perception can matter more than truth, and the perception was that Zone 10 had crossed a line. Wiz the Wizard was not just a rapper, but a name tied into music circles, Sniper Gang affiliations, and Broward's growing rap identity. When his younger brother was killed, eyes turned to him and to his people for a response. The silence that followed from official channels only fueled the anger within neighborhoods like Liberia and Dania. The families affected by the violence felt justice would never come from the courts. That belief made the feud even more dangerous because retaliation became the only answer they trusted. Zone 10 members interpreted the street talk differently, seeing the reactions from Liberia and HMT as pressure against their reputation. In their minds, the murder of Jib was not something that would make them back down. Instead, it pushed them to double down on their connection with Psycho Bob and the Nightmares. The alliance between Zone 10 and the Nightmares was already being formed, but now it became official. They branded themselves Double M, which stood for more money, more motion, and more murder. That name carried weight in Broward because everyone knew what it meant. Zone 10 and the Nightmares were no longer just neighborhood cliques. They had become one unit built on a pledge of violence and loyalty. On the opposite side, HMT members and their Liberia allies locked arms in response to the killing. The Haitian Money Team, already rooted in Haitian American neighborhoods, saw the death of Jib as a direct strike at their community. Liberia's young steppers, who already carried their own fierce reputation, joined forces with HMT without hesitation. Together, they formed a side that could match the numbers, reputation, and aggression of Zone 10 and MM. The blocks of Dania and Liberia were now split into two camps that refused to recognize neutrality. Every young man had to decide where he stood, and any sign of neutrality was seen as betrayal. That division cut across schools, parties, and even family ties. From this point forward, Broward County became the stage for a conflict that refused to burn out. Every action on one side demanded a reaction from the other side, and the cycle moved quickly. Retaliation became the only language that mattered between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia. The balance of power shifted every time a gun went off, and nobody wanted to be seen as the crew that took the loss. Police records from those years show a spike in shootings, robberies, and violent incidents connected to these neighborhoods. Behind each statistic were young men trying to prove loyalty to their crews, while mothers and families carried the grief. The death of Jib turned what had been neighborhood politics into something that touched rap, identity, and community pride. Wiz the Wizard kept moving in his music career, but the shadow of his brother's murder followed him. Psycho Bob grew more entrenched with Zone 10 MM and began to wear that badge proudly in the streets and in music. HMT Trey carried the flag for Haitian Money Team, moving with the intent to show that his crew would not back down. Liberia Sig emerged as a leader for the Liberian Steppers, showing that his name meant power both inside and outside the neighborhood. These names started to dominate every conversation in Broward when violence was mentioned. For kids growing up in Dania Beach, the lines were now clear. There was no middle ground, no safe place where someone could ignore the feud. Parties, street corners, and even schools became dangerous for anyone tied to either side. Every fight, every social media post, and every diss track carried the possibility of another shooting. The murder of Jib did not just remove one life, it created a wave that kept building. The blocks of Dania and Liberia became known not just locally, but across Florida as the home of a deadly war. What had once been two neighborhoods filled with immigrant families chasing the American dream turned into a battlefield where every move was measured in blood. The spark from October 2016 lit a fire that kept burning for years. Neither arrests nor courtrooms could cool down what had started with that one murder. Zone 10, MM, and HMT Liberia were now locked into a cycle where every death demanded another. The rest of Broward County watched as a feud turned into one of the most infamous wars Florida had ever seen. By 2017, the beef between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia had already built momentum that nobody could slow down. The neighborhoods were on edge, and every small argument or sighting could turn violent within minutes. One of the first high-profile incidents during that year was the shooting at Psycho Bob and his close associate Brat. The two were riding through Broward when shooters opened fire in a clear attempt to eliminate them. Bullets tore through the vehicle, but both men managed to survive without fatal injuries. The streets quickly picked up on the story, and the attempted hit was seen as proof that the war was fully active. Bob carried himself afterward with the confidence of a survivor, and his legend in Dania Beach grew even stronger. Not long after that, another major event pushed the tension even higher when Psycho Bob and Brat pulled up to a party in West Park. The party was already crowded with young people from across Broward County, and tensions were thick because crews from both sides were present. Bob and Brat arrived strapped and ready to make a statement. Shots rang out during the chaos, and the party turned into a scene of panic. Witnesses later described how the two carried themselves as if they came to prove a point about fearlessness. Word of the West Park shooting spread across Broward instantly and confirmed to everyone that the beef had no boundaries. Even social gatherings where kids just wanted to dance could become battlegrounds if the wrong faces showed up. Law enforcement eventually arrested Psycho Bob for charges tied to weapons and prior robberies, leading him to spend time in prison again. For many young men, prison would slow their momentum, but for Bob, it added to his credibility. Behind bars, he connected even deeper with Kodak Black and members of Sniper Gang. Kodak had grown up in Pompano Beach and understood the type of environment that raised Bob. Their conversations inside built a bond that would later change Bob's path. By the time he returned to the streets, his name carried not only the respect of Dania Beach, but also the backing of Kodak's growing music empire. That connection meant he had a foot in the rap industry while still tied into the same violence outside. Social media played a heavy role during these years and became the gasoline poured on every spark of violence. Instagram Lives were the new street corners where young men flashed guns, stacks of money, and taunted rivals. Posts were made within hours of shootings, often showing laughter, coded messages, or outright insults aimed at the other side. Every time a member of Zone 10 MM or HMT Liberia hit that live button, hundreds of viewers tuned in, including enemies watching for weaknesses. Disrespect online was not something that could be ignored, because on the streets ignoring an insult could look like weakness. The cycle became clear. An online post led to heated comments, which turned into location leaks, which turned into drive-by shootings or ambushes. Psycho Bob himself became a central figure in this online warfare because of his fearless way of speaking. He mocked rivals openly, dropped names, and laughed about situations that most people would not dare mention in public. That attitude made his fan base grow, but also painted a bigger target on his back. For HMT Liberia members, every word he spoke was taken as a challenge. His confidence made it seem like he was untouchable, which only motivated the other side to prove otherwise. The more he went online, the more dangerous his everyday life became because enemies were tracking everything. The disrespect that spread across social media did not just stop with verbal taunts, it often included direct references to dead rivals. Young men posted pictures of funerals, mocked grieving families, and even used emojis to signal victory after killings. It was a cruel digital language that turned grief into entertainment for thousands of viewers. That new culture blurred the line between rap beef and real-life violence because many of these taunts came from rappers who already had music on the internet. Songs and videos doubled as threats, while Instagram Lives doubled as declarations of war. Fans often could not tell what was just music and what was a coded message for rivals. For the people actually involved, there was no confusion, and every lyric or post demanded a reply. By 2017 and 2018, the streets of Broward were locked into a rhythm where online and offline life fed each other. A diss post could be answered by gunfire within hours, and a shooting could be celebrated with a viral video the same night. The line between music clout and body counts had disappeared almost completely. Young men who might have once looked for a way into football, school, or trade work now looked at rap as a way to validate their street reputations. Success was measured not just by music streams, but by who had the most feared name in Broward. In that environment, Psycho Bob's connection to Kodak Black made him a star in both rap and street terms. His enemies, however, never stopped seeing him as a target. The war was still moving forward with every post, every party, and every night on the block. By 2020, the feud between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia had already left bodies across Broward County, but the streets were not prepared for what happened next. Violence between crews usually targeted rivals, close friends, or affiliates, but in this case, the war expanded to people who had never picked up a gun. The first signs of that shift came when shooters targeted Dorothy Smart, the mother of Camrell Psycho Bob Smart. One night, her home in Dania Beach was sprayed with bullets in a clear attempt to kill her. She managed to survive that attack, but it sent shockwaves across Broward because people realized that even mothers were now considered targets. For older residents who had watched gang politics for decades, this was something they never thought they would see. Dorothy Smart was a well-known figure in her neighborhood, respected for raising her family and staying out of street politics. When word spread that someone had tried to kill her just because she was Bob's mother, people started to whisper about the code being broken. In the past, gang violence in Florida might hit rivals directly or sometimes innocent bystanders, but mothers were generally off limits. Even hardcore figures admitted that targeting a man's mother crossed a boundary that once existed. The first attempt on Dorothy did not take her life, but it set the stage for something much darker. People realized that once the rule was broken, nothing would stop the other side from going further. In March 2021, the violence reached another level when Misty Hopkins, the mother of Trayvon HMT Trey Key, was killed in Miami Gardens. Misty was running her beauty salon like she did every week when masked shooters stormed inside and ambushed her. They gunned her down in her own place of business, leaving her employees and customers in shock. This killing showed the world that the feud was no longer about rival members, but about breaking spirits by destroying families. News outlets covered the murder heavily because of how unusual and cruel it was. Mothers were supposed to be untouchable, but the war between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia had turned everything upside down. The death of Misty Hopkins hit HMT hard because she was not only Trey's mother, but also someone who represented stability in that neighborhood. Her murder became a rallying point for Liberia and Haitian money team members who felt that revenge was the only possible response. For them, Dorothy Smart had already been targeted once, and now Misty's death demanded retaliation. Social media filled with coded messages and comments from affiliates suggesting that this war had reached a point of no return. From that moment on, the phrase that circled Broward was that no one was safe in this beef. 2 years later, the feud crossed its darkest line yet when Dorothy Smart was assassinated in September 2023. She was leaving her home in Dania Beach, standing near her driveway, when shooters pulled up and opened fire. This time she did not survive, and the execution-style hit shocked even the people who thought they had already seen everything. For Broward residents, the death of Dorothy Smart marked the official collapse of any remaining street codes. She had survived the first attempt years earlier, but her killers returned with deadly precision. To many people in Dania and Liberia, this was no longer just a war between young men. It was a war that destroyed entire families. Street politics often carry rules that crews claim to follow, but the murders of Misty Hopkins and Dorothy Smart showed how fragile those rules really were. In old gang culture, mothers, children, and elders were supposed to be left alone. Even during bloody wars, those boundaries gave families a small sense of protection. When Broward's feud began targeting mothers, it shattered that illusion completely. The logic from the shooters was simple. If the other side started it, then nothing was off limits anymore. Each side pointed to the other as the first to break the code, using that as justification for the next murder. That cycle of blame meant the violence only escalated further. Community reaction was filled with horror because these women were known as mothers first, not as players in any gang. Neighbors, pastors, and community leaders spoke out about the senselessness of dragging family into street beefs. Candlelight vigils were held, but fear overshadowed the gatherings because people wondered if attending could make them targets too. Families across Broward started to worry that their own relatives could be next, even if they had nothing to do with the feud. Mothers began pleading with their sons to leave the streets, but those pleas rarely worked because pride and loyalty pulled stronger. The killings of Dorothy and Misty became symbols of how deep the hatred between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia had grown. Rap fans watching from the outside often struggled to understand why mothers became targets, but inside Broward, the answer was revenge. The rivals justified every act by pointing back at who fired first. Once Dorothy was shot at in 2020, Liberia members claimed the line had already been crossed. When Misty was killed in 2021, Zone 10 affiliates claimed it was payback for Dorothy's earlier attack. When Dorothy was assassinated in 2023, Liberia voices pointed to Misty's death as the reason. That endless back and forth created a circle that had no real exit. Every side believed the other had started it, so every act of revenge felt justified. By this point, the feud earned a name that spread beyond Florida. People began saying that Zone 10 and HMT Liberia were hunting each other's mothers. The phrase sounded almost unbelievable, but it matched the grim reality of Broward County. Music blogs, YouTube channels, and news articles all repeated the phrase because it captured the tragedy perfectly. For outsiders, it sounded like the plot of a movie, but for families living in Dania Beach and Miami Gardens, it was their everyday nightmare. The war had crossed into a place where even those who gave life to the soldiers of the streets were being taken. The targeting of mothers highlighted the complete collapse of boundaries in this conflict. What started with robberies and shootings between young men evolved into a cycle of revenge that tore into the very foundation of family. Dorothy Smart and Misty Hopkins were not armed gang members. They were women trying to live their lives. Their deaths became the ultimate proof that in Broward's violent feud, no one was truly untouchable. The fear that spread across communities was not just about being caught in crossfire anymore. It was about becoming a direct target simply because of who your children were. That shift changed the way everyone looked at the war. It was no longer about respect or clout. It was about destruction at any cost. By 2023, people across Florida understood that Broward County had become the home of one of the most ruthless gang wars in recent memory. The killings of mothers showed that the conflict had erased every line of decency that once existed in street life. Zone 10, MM, and HMT Liberia had rewritten the rules in blood, proving that nothing was sacred in their battle. From that point on, every story about Broward's violence carried the shadow of those mothers. Their names became attached to the war's identity, a reminder of how far things had gone. This is the reason why the feud is remembered not just for the numbers of deaths, but for the way it shattered every code of the streets. By 2021, the Broward feud had already claimed lives, but music and clout pushed the conflict into another arena. That January, Bill Capri, better known as Kodak Black, walked free after receiving a presidential pardon from Donald Trump. Kodak had been serving time for federal gun charges, and many thought his career was finished. Instead, he came home celebrated, and one of his first moves was signing names already tied to Broward's violent war. He signed Camrell's Psycho Bob Smart, Wisdom Williams aka Wiz the Wizard, and another young rapper called Wham. The move gave his sniper gang label more credibility, but also tied him directly into the streets of Dania Beach in Liberia. For people watching inside Broward, Kodak's decision was not viewed as just business. On the streets, it looked like Kodak had officially chosen a side in the ongoing feud. Signing Psycho Bob meant Sniper Gang was now linked with Zone 10 and MM, because Bob's crew had already made that connection clear. Signing Wiz Da Wizard tied the label even deeper into Dania Beach, because Wiz had family caught up in the feud after his brother Jib was murdered. To HMT and Liberia members, Kodak's actions looked like a declaration that Sniper Gang was supporting their enemies. That perception gave the beef even more weight, because now rap industry moves were interpreted as street moves. The impact of those signings was felt immediately when new music started dropping from Sniper Gang affiliates. Songs like Nightmares carried energy that was both musical and threatening. Listeners who knew the streets understood that these tracks doubled as statements about the feud. When diss tracks hit YouTube, they were replayed thousands of times, not just by fans, but by rivals looking for hidden messages. Nightmares was more than a song. It was another spark thrown into an already burning fire. The lyrics carried coded threats that the other side could not ignore, and every verse deepened the rivalry. Psycho Bob, who began releasing music under the name Psycho Bob, with an S, used the platform to amplify his reputation. He did not just rap about money and cars, he rapped directly about his enemies. At the same time, his social media presence became a constant stream of disrespect aimed at rivals. He openly trolled dead rivals' families, posted comments about murders, and mocked the grief of enemies. One of his most infamous taunts was claiming that he had slept with the mother of Sigmund, Liberia Sig Brown, one of the leaders of the Liberia crew. Bob even released a song called Stepdaddy, where he played into the claim, fueling outrage across Liberia's side. To him, it was all about clout and image, but to his rivals, it was another insult demanding retaliation. Every time Bob went online, he seemed determined to blur the line between entertainment and real life. His lives on Instagram have featured guns, money, and taunts aimed directly at people who had lost friends and family. In any other city, fans might have brushed it off as bravado, but in Broward, the words had real consequences. The enemies he mocked lived just a few blocks away, and every post was seen as a challenge. Social media became a stage where rappers like Bob could build careers while simultaneously inviting deadly attention. The online disrespect guaranteed that the war was not going to cool down. The rap industry turned into an amplifier for the violence because careers were rising off the back of the beef. Kodak Black's Sniper Gang gained attention because its roster included names tied to the conflict. Local rappers used references to shootings and murders to gain streams and views, knowing fans were eager for the raw content. Each diss track acted like a commercial for the street life, bringing in listeners while making enemies even angrier. Careers that might have taken years to build gained traction overnight because of the connection to Broward's bloody headlines. Rap did not just reflect the feud, it gave young men a reason to escalate so they could turn tragedies into songs. Clout became the currency that mattered most in this era of the war. A single video posted hours after a shooting could rack up thousands of views and spread across Florida in minutes. Killings were no longer just tragedies in the community, they became viral moments that rappers used for credibility. Fans outside Broward watched with fascination, sometimes not realizing that real mothers were burying their children behind the headlines. For those inside Dania Beach and Liberia, clout meant danger, because every viral moment led to another cycle of retaliation. Young rappers saw that controversy brought fame, and the temptation to provoke rivals grew stronger with every click and comment. The connection between rap and the streets in Broward reached a point where it was impossible to separate them. Kodak Black's label gave legitimacy to rappers who lived the lifestyle they rapped about, and fans rewarded them with attention. At the same time, the enemies they insulted refused to let the disrespect slide. Every song, every post, and every video created more pressure on both sides to respond violently. The feud between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia was already one of the bloodiest in Florida, but rap culture poured gasoline on it daily. By 2021 and 2022, Broward County was not just a battleground for guns, it was a stage where music and murder fed each other endlessly. By 2021, Broward County was already drowning in violence, but the next few years turned the feud between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia into something unforgettable. Every month seemed to bring another headline about someone being gunned down in a neighborhood, on a highway, or outside a business. The cycle of retaliation took full control, and the community lived in fear knowing that almost any place could turn into a shooting gallery. The first major blow in this stretch came in September 2021 with the death of Wiz the Wizard. Wiz had been signed to Kodak Black's Sniper Gang and was seen as one of Broward's most promising young rappers. His body was discovered outside a home in Dania Beach, lying face down on the grass. Police gave little detail, but everybody on the streets understood this was tied to the ongoing war. Wiz's death not only silenced a rising rapper, but also sent a message across Broward that anyone connected to Zone 10 MM could be touched. Fans mourned the loss, but rivals celebrated online, mocking his death in posts that poured gasoline on the fire. The killing of Wiz the Wizard showed the world that rap success could not protect someone from the realities of Broward's violent streets. After Wiz's death, shootings across Broward and Miami Gardens picked up even more. The year 2022 carried multiple incidents of drive-by shootings and home invasions that were barely covered in mainstream news. By 2023, the bloodbath was impossible to ignore as the list of dead names grew longer. In March 2023, Antoine Sauce Dobard, a well-known face in the neighborhood and an affiliate tied into the feud, was shot dead. Sauce was ambushed and killed in a scene that quickly drew attention from both sides. His death was immediately celebrated by enemies online, with taunts and posts that disrespected his memory. For his friends and family, Sauce's murder was another painful reminder that the war had no plans of slowing down. The violence that year only escalated as the feud spilled onto public highways where innocent people drove daily. In April 2023, a chilling attack took place on I-95 near Fort Lauderdale when gunmen sprayed bullets into a vehicle. Inside that car were Vernaldo Donner and Terry McKenzie, both killed instantly in the hail of gunfire. The brazenness of an attack on Florida's busiest highway terrified the public. Videos and photos of the crime scene spread quickly, showing cars stopped and traffic backed up while police searched for evidence. People in Broward realized that the feud was no longer contained to neighborhoods. It could strike anywhere. The highway shooting reminded everyone that the streets of Broward had no boundaries anymore. Just a few months later, in June 2023, another name was added to the list when Wayne Marlowe Top Smith was shot and killed. Marlowe Top was tied to the HMT and Liberia side and had a reputation as someone who moved with authority. His death brought out large crowds for his funeral, but it also sparked another round of online disrespect from Zone 10 MM affiliates. Taunts were thrown on Instagram Lives, turning grief into entertainment for thousands of viewers. Every death created another moment where rivals went online to clown the loss, and every post led to more violence on the streets. For the families left behind, it felt like mourning in public was impossible without being mocked by the other side. The summer of 2023 brought the most devastating strike when Dorothy Smart, the mother of Psycho Bob, was assassinated in her driveway. Dorothy had survived an earlier attempt on her life back in 2020, but this time she did not escape. On a quiet September evening in Dania Beach, shooters pulled up and executed her outside her own home. Neighbors heard the gunfire and rushed to find her body lying near her car. The killing shocked the entire county, not just because she was Bob's mother, but because she represented the breaking of every supposed street code. The death of Dorothy Smart stood as the emotional climax of the feud, proof that no one was untouchable. For Broward residents, the murder of mothers had become the darkest symbol of this bloody war. By 2024, the violence had begun claiming younger lives who were not even central players in the feud. In January of that year, 17-year-old Terrence Farrington Jr. was shot dead in a Best Buy parking lot. Terrence was known as a regular teenager who enjoyed sports and music, but he had friends tied into one side of the war. That connection was enough to make him a target, and his death showed how easily teenagers could be pulled into this cycle. Families shopping at the plaza that day were left traumatized after witnessing another young life cut short. The tragedy continued just months later in March 2024, when 19-year-old Johnny Henderson was gunned down while sitting at a traffic light. His car was boxed in by shooters who opened fire, leaving him dead in a public scene that horrified passing drivers. Johnny's murder proved that even the most ordinary moments in Broward could turn fatal if someone was caught in the wrong place. For residents, the realization was terrifying. Laundromats, driveways, parking lots, and highways were all potential killing zones. The war had turned everyday life into a constant risk of violence. The bloodbath years from 2021 to 2024 showed a clear pattern that could no longer be ignored. Friends of rivals, affiliates of both sides, and even complete innocents were being hunted down. The list of dead stretched from rappers to respected mothers to teenagers still in school. The violence was not random. It followed a cycle where each death created another reason for revenge. Police reports filled with names, while social media filled with mocking videos and coded threats. Every murder became both a local tragedy and a viral talking point, feeding the same machine that encouraged escalation. For the community, living in Broward during these years felt like surviving in a war zone. People avoided certain streets at night, skipped parties where the wrong names might appear, and prayed daily for their children's safety. Parents told kids not to post their locations online because enemies were watching closely. Funerals became regular gatherings where families wore t-shirts with faces of the dead, only to return weeks later for another service. The grief seemed endless, and the violence felt unstoppable. The murders of mothers like Dorothy Smart and Misty Hopkins stood at the center of the pain because they proved that even the most sacred bonds were broken. Once mothers were hunted, every family in Broward understood that the war had gone too far, yet the killings continued, showing that revenge had replaced every other value. The bloodbath years carved scars into Broward County that will never heal. Every name added to the list became another reminder that this feud destroyed not just enemies, but entire communities. By 2022, the weight of federal investigations finally caught up with Derek Soldier Slade. After years of violence, including 3 murders committed in November 2015, federal prosecutors charged him under RICO statutes. The trial revealed home invasions, senseless shootings, and his role as a driving force behind Broward's spiral. In court, prosecutors called him the heart of a conspiracy that terrorized neighborhoods. That same year, Slade was convicted and handed 2 life sentences plus 30 years. The ruling ended his role in the streets, but did little to slow down the wider war. For many in Broward, his conviction was both a relief and a reminder of how deep the violence had gone. Law enforcement across Broward County, especially the Broward Sheriff's Office, began intensifying efforts to connect the dots between shootings. Detectives used ballistics testing to link shell casings found at multiple crime scenes. Fingerprints recovered from abandoned vehicles gave prosecutors more leverage to pursue conspiracy charges. Social media posts and Instagram lives became digital evidence, tying suspects directly to shootings they had bragged about. By 2023, the cases were piling up, showing investigators how both Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia operated with patterns that resembled organized crime families. Each new file added more names to the list of suspects and targets. The major breakthrough arrived in November 2024 when authorities announced one of the largest gang indictments in Broward history. 8 suspects were indicted on a sweeping 33-count RICO case. They were charged with 8 murders and multiple attempted murders connected to the feud. Public names included Sigmund Liberia Sig Brown, Trayvon HMT Trey Key, Jared Hatch McCabe, and Kavaris Johnson. Each name carried heavy weight in the neighborhoods, and their arrests represented a major blow to HMT Liberia. The indictments painted a picture of crews operating like criminal organizations, complete with hierarchy, retaliation strategies, and a culture of silence. Officials called it a victory for the community, arguing that the most violent players were finally off the streets. During press conferences, authorities declared that Broward County was safer now that these figures were locked up. They pointed to reductions in shootings following the arrests as proof that their strategy worked. For families of victims, however, the relief felt incomplete. Trauma from years of drive-by shootings, murders of mothers, and teenagers killed at traffic lights could not be erased by a single RICO bus. Communities in Dania Beach, Liberia, and Hollywood still carried scars from a decade of bloodshed. Mothers who had lost sons still wore memorial shirts, and children still carried the memory of gunfire outside their homes. For many, the damage was permanent. Through all of this, Camrell's Psycho Bob Smart remained a strange survivor. He was signed to Kodak Black's Sniper Gang, released music, and maintained a presence online. Yet he also lived with the weight of losing friends, family, and eventually his own mother. Dorothy Smart's assassination in 2023 marked a devastating personal blow that even rap success could not cover. While rivals faced long prison sentences, Bob remained on the outside, still tied to both music and the streets. His survival symbolized both resilience and tragedy, because every gain in clout came with another round of losses. As 2024 ended, the question lingered: could Broward's neighborhoods truly heal? or would the cycle of revenge rise again despite the crackdowns? By late 2024, the war between Zone 10 MM and HMT Liberia had been slowed by courts, arrests, and funerals, but the scars remained carved into Broward County. Decades from now, people will still remember how everyday places like driveways, highways, and parking lots turned into battlefields. The feud became infamous not just for the number of deaths, but for crossing lines no one thought possible, especially the killings of mothers who had nothing to do with the streets. The music born from this violence kept the story alive, turning tragedies into lyrics and beef into viral content. Psycho Bob continued to rap under Kodak Black's sniper gang, surviving longer than many expected, but carrying the burden of watching friends, affiliates, and even his own mother fall victim. To some, he remained proof of survival. To others, he symbolized the never-ending loop between clout and destruction. For Broward residents, the legacy of this feud is complicated. Law enforcement declared victories, politicians claimed communities were safer, and rap fans followed the drama online. But the families left behind knew that no conviction or charting song could erase the pain. The war between Zone 10 and HMT Liberia will be remembered as one of Florida's darkest street conflicts, a story where revenge replaced every boundary and where the cost of respect was measured in blood.